The voices drifted through the thin pine walls of her bedroom on a Sunday morning in April of 1878, and Mary Shepard pressed her hand flat against her chest, as if she could hold her own heart still. She recognized the hymn before she recognized the voices. "Be Thou My Vision." The ancient Irish melody, the one her mother had sung over a washboard in a cramped Cincinnati kitchen. The one Mary had whispered under her breath every single morning since crossing into New Mexico territory 3 months ago. The one she had never, not once, mentioned to another living soul in the town of Redemption. And yet here it was, rising into the pale gold of a desert Sunday morning, sung in two young voices that cracked on the high notes and recovered with fierce determination, sung outside her window as though the world itself had decided to answer a prayer she had been too afraid to speak aloud. She did not move for a full minute. Then she crossed the room in 3 steps, threw back the burlap curtain, and looked down into the dusty yard below her boarding house window. 2 boys stood in the sparse morning shadow of a juniper tree. The older one, she guessed him to be about 12, had his hat pressed to his chest and his eyes squeezed shut with the effort of remembering the words. The younger one, perhaps 9, stood straight as a soldier, his chin lifted, singing as if he were auditioning for angels. They were both the image of their father. Elijah Keating stood 15 feet behind them with his hat in his hands, watching her window with an expression she had no name for yet. It was not quite hope. It was something rawer than that, something that looked like a man who had ridden through a dark forest for a very long time and had just caught the first smell of wood smoke from a fire that might still be burning. Mary Shepard gripped the windowsill and told herself not to cry. She did not succeed. And she knew, standing there with the April light cutting across the floorboards behind her, and those 2 boys singing a hymn only God should have known she loved, that whatever wall she had spent 3 months carefully building between herself and Elijah Keating had just been sung down to rubble. She needed to go back to the beginning to understand how she had arrived at a Sunday morning that could break her and save her at the same time. She had come to Redemption, New Mexico territory, in January of 1878 on the back of a freight wagon driven by a man named Amos Dill, who smelled of tobacco and spoke perhaps 15 words the entire 4-day journey from Santa Fe. Mary had not minded the silence. Silence was something she had learned to live inside like a house. Her former life in Cincinnati had collapsed around her the previous autumn with a completeness that still made her chest ache when she thought about it too directly, the way you avoided looking straight at the sun. Her father, Harold Shepard, had run a modest but respectable dry goods store on Vine Street for 22 years. He had been, as far as Mary knew, a decent and ordinary man. He had been wrong on both counts. When the truth came out that fall, it came out all at once, like a dam breaking. Harold Shepard had been swindling suppliers for years, padding accounts and skimming money into a private fund that his wife and his only daughter had known nothing about. When the creditors arrived, they took everything. The store, the house, the furniture, the small pearl earrings Mary's mother had worn every Sunday to church. Her mother, Eleanor, had survived exactly 6 weeks past the revelation before pneumonia made the decision for her that grief had been building toward anyway. Mary had buried her on a gray November morning. In a plot she paid for with the last $12 she had managed to keep hidden in the lining of her coat. Her father was in a federal court in Columbus by then, facing a trial she had no desire to attend. She had been 24 years old, alone, and possessed of a teaching certificate from Cincinnati Normal School, 3 dresses, a Bible, a small leather-bound journal her mother had given her for her 21st birthday, and exactly no future she could see from where she was standing. An advertisement in the back of a Cincinnati newspaper had changed the direction of her life with 12 lines of small print. Wanted, schoolteacher, Redemption, New Mexico territory, room and board provided, salary $11 per month. Applicants must supply references and letter of intention. Write, Town Council of Redemption, care of Postmaster General, Santa Fe, NM. She had written the letter the same afternoon she found the advertisement. The Town Council of Redemption had responded within 3 weeks, which told her they were desperate, and she had accepted their offer within 3 days, which told them she was too. She had never been west of the Ohio River. She did not know what New Mexico territory looked like or smelled like or how the sky would feel there. She did not know a single person who had ever been to Redemption. She packed everything she owned into a single carpetbag and a battered trunk, took the train to Kansas City, then south to Albuquerque on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, and then climbed into Amos Dill's freight wagon for the last leg of the journey into the high desert. Redemption was smaller than she had expected, which was saying something because she had expected very little. A main street of packed red dirt, maybe 20 buildings in varying states of permanence, a saloon called the Silver Spur, a general store, a livery stable, a church that doubled as the schoolhouse on weekdays, and a 2-story boarding house run by a widow named Clara Hutchins who was sharp as tacks and fed her boarders remarkably well. The town had been carved out of the desert by people who refused to accept that the land was not offering them an invitation. There was a marshal, a man named Frank Dade, who wore his authority loosely and seemed to spend most of his time on his porch. There was a doctor named Harmon Priestley, who was good with a bone saw and surprisingly gentle with children. There were farmers and ranchers and their families spread across the territory around the town, coming in on Saturdays for supplies and Sundays for church. And there was Elijah Keating. She heard his name before she saw his face, which perhaps was how it was always going to work between them, because the name arrived with so much attached to it that she needed time to prepare. She had been at Clara Hutchins's boarding house for precisely 2 days when Clara sat down across the breakfast table from her and said, with the particular tone of a woman delivering necessary intelligence, "You will meet Elijah Keating at church on Sunday. I want to tell you about him first so you are not blindsided." Mary had set down her coffee cup. "All right. He is a good man," Clara said with the precision of someone choosing those words carefully, "and a difficult one. He ranches about 6 miles east of town on land he has worked for 8 years. He has 2 sons, Samuel and Daniel. Samuel is 12, Daniel is 9. Their mother, Elijah's wife, her name was Ruth. She died of a rattlesnake bite 4 years ago. She stepped off the porch one August morning without her boots on, and that was that, gone in a day and a half." Mary felt the particular weight of that settle over the table. "That is a terrible thing," she said quietly. "It was," Clara agreed. "It changed him. He was never what you would call easy, but he had a lightness before. He has been raising those boys alone since then, which he does well enough, better than most men would, but he keeps himself at a distance from everything and everyone. He comes to church, he comes to town for supplies, he does his business, and he goes home. He does not socialize, he does not accept invitations. He lost a good hired hand last spring and has been running the ranch largely alone with the help of the boys, which is too much for any one man." "Why are you telling me this?" Mary asked. Clara looked at her with pale blue eyes that missed very little. "Because you are going to be the school teacher for his boys, and because I have lived long enough to know when a situation has the potential to become complicated, and I would rather warn you than have you stumble into it." Mary had nodded and thanked her, and she had believed, in the uncomplicated way that people believe things before they know better, that she would maintain a clean professional distance from Elijah Keating and focus on teaching his sons and the other 11 children of Redemption to read and write and cipher. She had believed that right up until the moment she saw him. He came into the church that first Sunday morning behind his boys, and Mary, who was standing at the front of the room being introduced to her new congregation by Pastor Elias Webb, had to keep her expression completely professional and deliberately pleasant while her entire internal landscape shifted without asking her permission. Elijah Keating was tall in the way that some men from the frontier were tall, as if the wide sky had stretched them up to match itself. He was lean but broad across the shoulders, with the particular build of a man who worked hard physical labor every day of his life, not for aesthetics, but because the work required it, and there was no way around it. He had dark hair that needed cutting and went silver at both temples, though she would later learn he was only 32 years old. His face was weathered but not coarsened, and his eyes, she caught the color from halfway across the room, were a startling shade of gray-green that she later thought of privately as the color of sage after rain. He did not smile at her introduction. He did not frown either. He looked at her the way a careful man looks at something new that has entered his territory, with a full and measured attention that had no performance in it at all, and then he looked away and sat down. Mary had preached attentiveness and self-possession to herself all the way through Pastor Webb's introduction, and she had managed both, but her hands had been clasped behind her back, and she had been pressing her thumbnails into her palms the whole time. The first week of school arrived the following Monday. She had 9 students that first morning, the other 2 being older teenagers who came in later in the week. Samuel Keating arrived precisely on time with his hat already off and his dark hair combed flat against his head, and Daniel Keating arrived 2 minutes late with a smear of something she chose not to identify on his left cuff and a gap-toothed grin that was, she had to admit, utterly disarming. "I was helping with the horses," Daniel announced to the room without embarrassment, as if this explained everything, which in his world it did. "You may sit down, Daniel," Mary said pleasantly, and he did. She was a good teacher. She had always known it, the same way some people know they can sing or swim, not arrogance but honest self-awareness. She had a gift for explaining things simply, and a patience with confusion that her Cincinnati schoolmistress had called remarkable. Within a week she had her students' trust, and within 2 weeks she had their genuine engagement, which was the harder thing to earn. Samuel was quiet and absorbing, the kind of student who appeared not to be paying attention and then answered every question with precision. He was protective of his brother in a way that was already becoming more paternal than sibling, the 4 years since their mother's death having deposited responsibilities on him that a 12-year-old should not have had to carry. Mary noticed this and made small accommodations for it, giving him independent work that respected his intelligence while also making sure he had moments of just being a boy in a classroom, rather than a small adult managing a situation. Daniel was exuberant and easily distracted, and could not multiply past 6 without using his fingers, but he had the most voracious appetite for stories she had ever encountered in a student. She began reading to the class for the last 20 minutes of each afternoon, working through a battered copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer that she had brought from Cincinnati, and Daniel would sit with his elbows on his desk and his chin in his hands and his eyes so enormous that she sometimes had to look away from him to keep her composure. She saw Elijah Keating and his sons constantly. Samuel had his father's careful watchfulness. Daniel had his father's jaw, and what she suspected was his father's capacity for stubbornness. She learned this by indirect and professional observation, which was the only kind she allowed herself. She allowed herself no other kind. This was a resolution that held for exactly 3 weeks. The fracture point was a Tuesday afternoon in February, cold and gray, with the wind scraping across the desert in a way that made the church building creak and moan. She had kept the students later than usual, because they were in the middle of a geography lesson that had caught fire in a way she hadn't expected. The children, suddenly riveted by the idea that the world contained deserts other than their own, that somewhere there were pyramids and jungles, and seas that stretched beyond imagining. She sent them home at 4 o'clock, half an hour past the usual time, and was banking the small iron stove against the cold when the door opened and Elijah Keating walked in. He stopped just inside the doorway, filling it, and looked at her across the empty room with those unsettling gray-green eyes. "My boys were not on the road at the usual time," he said. It was not an accusation, but it contained the shadow of one. "I kept them a little late," she said, keeping her voice even. The lesson was going well. I should have sent a note. I apologize for the worry. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. They got home safe, he said. Daniel would not stop talking about Egypt. A very small, involuntary smile crossed her face before she could arrest it. He asked remarkably good questions. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the place where a smile might live if it were given permission. He asks questions about everything, he said. His mother was the same way. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. The way a silence takes on weight when someone has said something they did not fully intend to say. Mary turned back to the stove to give him the privacy of a moment to recover himself, and when she turned back he was looking at the map she had pinned to the wall beside the chalkboard, a large hand-drawn map of the world that she had copied from a geography book. "Where did you go to school?" he asked without looking at her. "Cincinnati Normal School," she said. "Teachers' College. A long way from here." "Yes." He looked at her then. "Why did you come?" The question was blunt and direct, with no social cushioning around it. She appreciated bluntness generally, but this particular question had enough truth buried in it that she had to decide how much of it she wanted to excavate in front of a man she barely knew. "There was nothing left to keep me there," she said, which was honest without being a full accounting. He seemed to understand that she had answered as much as she intended to, and he did not press. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a desk and said, "Boys speak well of you," and then he left. She stood in the cold, creaking church building and thought that she was in a certain amount of trouble and that she needed to be very careful. She spent the next several weeks being very careful. She kept her interactions with Elijah Keating brief and professional. When he came to church on Sundays, she nodded politely and sat with Clara Hutchins, and did not allow her eyes to drift in his direction more than was absolutely unavoidable given the small size of the space. When he came to the school to pick up his boys after a late lesson, she relayed information about their progress in the clipped and pleasant tones of a professional educator, and did not stand any closer to him than necessary. This was harder than it sounded, and it got harder rather than easier, which was not how she had planned for it to go. The problem, and she was honest enough with herself to call it a problem, was that Elijah Keating kept doing small things that refused to let her maintain the comfortable fiction that he was simply the father of 2 students and nothing more. He repaired the church building's back window in late February without being asked, because he had noticed it rattling and understood that rattling in February in New Mexico territory meant cold air getting in, and cold air getting in meant the children were cold while they were trying to learn. He said nothing about having done it. She noticed it on a Monday morning and asked Clara, who told her it had been Elijah on Saturday. He sent a side of venison to the boarding house in early March with a note that said only, "For Mrs. Hutchins and boarders." And Clara told her with an expression of elaborate innocence that in the 8 years she had known Elijah Keating he had never once sent venison to the boarding house before. He began, sometime in March, to simply be present in moments when she might have needed help, without being obvious about it. When a group of older boys from out of town rode through Redemption on a Friday afternoon and made comments in her direction that were the kind of comments men made when they thought distance made them anonymous, Elijah materialized from the direction of the general store and simply stood there on the street looking at them until they rode on. He did not speak to her afterward. He walked to his horse, untied it, and rode east. She told herself each of these things was nothing. She was constructing a lie so elaborate she was starting to believe it herself. The day it finally fell apart was a Saturday in late March, 3 months after her arrival. She had gone to the general store run by a man named Howard Briggs to purchase paper and ink for the school. The Territory Council allotted a small budget for school supplies, and it needed to be stretched carefully. She was standing at the counter going through her list with Howard Briggs when a man she did not recognize came into the store behind her and began talking very loudly to Howard about a land dispute in a way that made it clear he had been drinking, though it was not yet noon. She stepped back from the counter to wait, and the man, whose name she never learned, stepped sideways into her with enough force to nearly knock her off her feet. She caught the edge of a shelf and kept herself upright, but the jar of ink she had already paid for slipped from her hand and hit the floor and shattered, leaving a dark stain spreading across the planks. The man laughed, not in a genuinely amused way but in the aggressive way of someone who wants to see what they can get away with. "Well, that is a shame," he said, in a tone that indicated it was not. She was debating her response, which was going to be measured but clear, when the store door opened and Elijah Keating walked in. He took in the scene in less than 2 seconds, in the way that people who have lived dangerous lives develop a capacity to read a room instantly. He looked at the ink on the floor. He looked at the man. He looked at Mary. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in his bearing shifted into a register that she recognized as the kind of quiet that precedes thunder. "You broke something that belongs to Miss Shepard," Elijah said to the man. His voice was completely level. "I would appreciate you replacing it." The man looked at him with the slow calculation of someone deciding whether this was a fight he wanted. He arrived at his decision quickly, which suggested his judgment, whatever else its failures, was not entirely absent. "Sure," he said, and he put a coin on the counter and walked out. The door swung shut behind him. Howard Briggs began quietly mopping up the ink. Elijah looked at Mary. "Are you all right?" he asked. Just those 4 words, but he asked them the way you asked someone if they were all right when the answer truly mattered to you. She had been fine, actually. She was a woman who had navigated the collapse of her family and a solo journey across half a continent. A drunk man with poor spatial awareness was not going to undo her. But something about the way he asked it, the directness and the genuine concern underneath the restraint, cracked something loose in her chest that she had been trying to hold very carefully in place. "I am fine," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Keating." He held her gaze for a beat longer than was necessary, and then he nodded and turned toward the counter to do his own shopping. She left the store with her new jar of ink and walked 3 blocks in the March wind, telling herself she was not going to think about him any more than was professional and necessary. She thought about him the entire way home. She lay awake that night constructing very reasonable arguments for why what she was feeling was inconvenient and inadvisable and potentially very painful. She knew precisely 3 significant things about Elijah Keating, and 2 of them suggested that she should keep her careful wall firmly in place. The first was that he was a father with 2 young sons, which meant that any romantic entanglement involving him was not a simple matter of 2 adults, but a much more complex equation with children's well-being and stability written into every variable. The second was that he had been deeply in love with his wife. She could see it in the way his sons spoke about their mother, in the particular careful reverence with which they handled the few things Ruth Keating had left behind, in the single time Elijah had mentioned her in Mary's presence, the way his voice had altered just slightly on the word, mother, as if the word still contained a tender wound. A man who had loved like that and lost like that did not simply redirect that capacity, or if he did it slowly and carefully and possibly never. The third thing she knew was that he was a good man. Clara had said it, and Clara was not generous with that assessment. Mary had seen it herself in 100 small evidences over 3 months. And goodness in a man, real goodness, not performed respectability but the actual thing, was, she was discovering, considerably more dangerous to her equilibrium than mere handsomeness or charm. She resolved, for the 4th time in 3 months, to be careful. The resolution lasted until Monday, when Samuel Keating arrived at school with a split lip and a careful blankness in his eyes that she recognized immediately as the look of a child who was protecting someone. She waited until the other students were occupied with their reading and called Samuel to her desk quietly. "What happened?" she asked, low enough that only he could hear. "Nothing," he said, which was exactly what a 12-year-old boy said when it was definitely something. "Samuel," she said, and she used a particular quality of voice she had learned, the one that was not commanding or threatening but simply patient and waiting, and absolutely certain that the truth would come eventually. He lasted about 30 seconds. "Some boys in town said something about our father," he said finally. "Said he was strange and didn't know how to get on with people, and that's why our mother," he stopped. Mary felt a surge of something so fierce she had to hold very still for a moment to keep it from showing on her face. "What did they say about your mother?" "Said it was better she died fast because she would have gone crazy living with him anyhow." The words came out flat and tight, the way words did when you were 12 years old and had been clenching them in your chest since they were said to you. Mary took one careful breath. "And the lip? The other boy has a worse eye," Samuel said, with a flash of something that was part shame and part not shame at all. She did not lecture him about fighting. That was not what this moment needed. Instead, she put her hand briefly on his shoulder and said, "Your father is not strange. He is a man who loves you both very much and has been doing an extraordinarily hard thing alone for 4 years. Anyone who says otherwise has not been paying attention." Samuel looked at her. His gray-green eyes, so much his father's eyes, were bright with something she chose not to name in a school room. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "Go back to your seat," she said gently. "And Sam, your father should know about this." She wrote a note that afternoon, brief and professional, informing Elijah that Samuel had been in an altercation in town and that she thought it warranted a conversation about what had been said. She gave it to Samuel to carry home, and she spent the rest of the afternoon managing a classroom with 12% of her attention, while the rest of it was occupied with a man who she was doing a very poor job of not caring about. He came to the school the next morning before class, hat in his hands, and knocked twice on the open door. She was alone, having arrived early to set up the day's lessons. She looked up from the chalkboard and said, "Good morning, Mr. Keating," and something about the way he was standing told her the note had affected him more than he wanted to show. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for handling it the way you did with Samuel." "Of course," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she waited, because she had learned by now that Elijah Keating said what he meant to say and no more, but that sometimes the meaning required a moment of silence around it. "He doesn't talk much about her," he said. "Ruth, either of them do not to me because they're trying to protect me from being sad about it, which is," he stopped. "They're 12 and 9 years old and they're trying to protect me." Mary set down the chalk very carefully and turned to face him fully. "They love you," she said, "and they've learned from you that love looks like protection." He looked at her steadily. "You understand children very well," he said. "I understand your children," she said, which was more specific, and the distinction landed between them in the quiet morning air. He held her gaze and she held his, and the silence had the particular quality of something that had been building for months and was now refusing to be contained by good sense and careful resolutions. "Miss Shepard," he said slowly, "I would consider it an honor if you would allow me to take you for a ride on Sunday after church. There is a part of this territory that I think is worth seeing," and he stopped again, restarted. "I should say directly that my intentions are respectful." Mary Shepard had spent 3 months building a wall and 3 months watching that wall develop cracks, and 3 months telling herself the wall was still standing when anyone objective could have seen it was largely rubble. "I would like that very much," she said, and the way his face changed when she said it, the careful, almost startled quality of his relief, told her something important about how long he had been working up to asking. The Sunday ride was the beginning of everything, and also the beginning of a new set of complications she had not fully anticipated. He arrived at Clara Hutchins's boarding house at 2 in the afternoon with 2 horses, one of which was a steady bay mare he had borrowed from the livery, and a small pack with what turned out to be cold biscuits and dried apple slices and a canteen of water, because the man prepared for things whether he was asked to or not. They rode east into the desert, where the land opened up into something so vast and so beautiful it made Mary's Cincinnati-formed heart quietly restructure itself around a new geography. The red rock rose in formations that looked carved rather than natural, and the late afternoon light made everything the color of old gold, and there were hawks riding thermal currents high above them in a sky so blue it seemed painted. She had forgotten, somewhere in the grief of the previous autumn and the long cold winter of starting over, that the world contained beauty that had nothing to do with circumstance. The desert reminded her. Elijah was different outside of town. Not looser exactly, because looseness was not in his nature but less compressed. The space agreed with him. He pointed out things with brief economical words. A mesa he called the altar, a spring hidden behind a rock formation that he said the Apache had used for generations, a particular formation of stones that settlers used as a landmark when the stars were obscured. He was teaching her the landscape, she realized, in the same patient way she taught his sons things that mattered. "How long have you been in the territory?" she asked as they ate the biscuits on a flat rock overlooking a wide valley. "Came out from Tennessee in 1870, he said. "With Ruth and Samuel, who was 4, staked the land claim in January of 1870 and started building. What drew you out?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley. Tennessee it was still recovering from the war. I was 17 when it ended, and I spent 4 years after watching men I knew try to rebuild things that were gone and couldn't come back. Ruth's family had lost everything. My family had very little to lose. There was a man who came through our town, a land agent, talking about New Mexico territory, how a man could claim land there and build something that was entirely his own, not built on anything that had come before. That appealed to me. He paused. It was a lie in the way that those promises always were. The land here has its own history, its own people who were pushed aside for settlers like me to come in. I know that. It sits uneasily with me. Mary looked at him. Not many men acknowledge that. Acknowledging it doesn't change it, he said, but I try to remember it. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone since arriving in New Mexico territory. About her father, about the swindle and the collapse and her mother's death, and the strange cold grief of losing someone to disappointment before you lost them to death. He listened without interrupting, without offering useless reassurances, without the particular discomfort that most people showed when someone else's darkness was laid bare in front of them. When she finished, the sun had dropped lower and the shadows had stretched long across the valley. "You came a very long way alone," he said. "I did," she agreed. "It took courage." "It took necessity," she said. "Courage and necessity look alike from the outside." He smiled at that, a real smile this time, and it changed his face so completely that she had to look away from it for a moment to steady herself. They rode back to town in the long evening light, and he walked her to Clara Hutchins's door and removed his hat and said good evening in the most formal way possible. And she went inside and sat down on the edge of her bed and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel something that resembled genuine hope. Then the complications arrived. The first complication was a woman named Patricia Elmore, who was the daughter of the largest landowner in the county, a man named Gerald Elmore who ran cattle on 12,000 acres east of the Keating Ranch. Patricia Elmore was 26 years old, accomplished, beautiful in a deliberate and self-aware way, and had been, according to Clara Hutchins, who delivered this information with the careful compassion of a surgeon, conducting what could charitably be called a campaign toward Elijah Keating for the better part of 2 years. "She has never been discouraged by his lack of response," Clara said, pouring coffee with the same equanimity she brought to all intelligence briefs. "Her father wants the Keating land. It would connect his eastern and western grazing land. Patricia is the mechanism." Mary received this information on a Wednesday evening and sat with it for several days. She was not, she told herself, going to allow it to affect her. She was not in competition with Patricia Elmore. She was not in any kind of arrangement with Elijah Keating. One Sunday afternoon ride was not a declaration. She was a school teacher in a small desert town with no family and no connections and no money beyond her $11 a month, and whatever she felt when she was near him was a private matter that she needed to manage with appropriate perspective. She had mostly convinced herself of this by Saturday morning, when she went to the general store for the school's weekly supply order and found Patricia Elmore there, talking to Howard Briggs about a dinner party she was planning at the Elmore house. And Elijah Keating was there too, at the back of the store. And Patricia turned when he came in and went directly to him with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the movement. "Elijah," she said, with a warmth so polished it had no rough edges at all, "I have been meaning to speak with you. Father is having a small dinner on Saturday, very informal. He would love to see you." Elijah nodded politely. He had seen Mary at the front of the store and their eyes had met briefly, and she had turned back to her list with professional composure. "I'll see about it," he said to Patricia. "Please do," she said warmly, and then looked toward the front of the store with the precise expression of someone who has just noticed something that requires acknowledgement. "Miss Shepard, how are you finding redemption?" "Very well, thank you," Mary said pleasantly. "It must be a change from city life," Patricia said, with the tone of someone commenting on something minor. "Many things are a change," Mary said. "I find I prefer it." Patricia smiled with all the right muscles and not the ones around her eyes. It was the only exchange they ever had, and it was enough for Mary to understand the full geometry of the situation. She went home and wrote in her journal that evening, "The dark past is not always one's own. Sometimes it is the situation one finds oneself in, the hidden motive behind kindness, the trap laid by desire for land and power disguised as dinner invitations. I will not become either a pawn or a fool." The second complication was more personal and more painful, and it came from within the Keating household itself. She discovered it by accident in the way that important things are often discovered, obliquely, when you are looking at something else. It was a Tuesday in early April. She had kept Samuel after class to discuss an essay he had written about the history of New Mexico Territory, which was remarkably good for a 12-year-old's work, and showed both the breadth of his reading and his father's influence in the attention to uncomfortable truths. They were talking about it when Daniel, who had been waiting outside in the dusty schoolyard for a good 20 minutes, came back inside wearing the expression he wore when patience had failed him. "Father is coming today himself," he announced to Samuel, as if this were relevant to the essay discussion. Mary glanced toward the door. "He usually sends you on horseback." "Horse through a shoe," Daniel said, sitting down on a desk with the easy informality of someone who considered the schoolhouse partially his own territory. "Father had to wait for the farrier. He was in a very quiet mood this morning." A very quiet mood was, she had learned, Daniel's way of describing a state she had privately begun to think of as Elijah's dark country, those stretches where something internal pulled him away from the surface in a way that his sons clearly recognized and navigated with practiced care. "Is he often in a very quiet mood?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. The boys exchanged a look across the room, that particular sibling communication that contained years of shared history. "Sometimes in April," Samuel said carefully. She understood immediately. April, the anniversary of something, or the approach of something. Ruth had died in August, Clara had said, but April held something too. She did not press. It was not her business, and they were children, and some doors were not hers to open. But when Elijah came to collect them an hour later, and she saw the quality of the silence he carried that day, deep and turned inward like an old wound that ached in particular weather, she felt something she had no clean name for, a kind of aching helplessness combined with a fierce protective instinct that she had not experienced before, and that clarified something for her with uncomfortable precision. She was in love with him. Not the beginning of love that was curiosity and attraction and pleasant anticipation, the actual thing. The kind that included the hard parts and the complicated parts, and the parts where you wanted to put your hand on someone's face and just hold them still in the world for a moment. This was distinctly inconvenient. She managed the school week with her full professional competence and her full internal chaos. And by Saturday, she had developed a new resolution, which was that she was going to do nothing about it, which was to say she was going to continue exactly as she was and wait for clarity and not do anything foolish. That resolution was the one Elijah Keating destroyed by asking her after church the following Sunday if he might call on her more formally. "I want to be direct with you," he said. They were standing in the yard outside the church in the early afternoon, the congregation having dispersed, his sons having vanished in the direction of a game of marbles with the Barrett children. "I have been trying to find the right words for several weeks, and I have concluded that I do not have right words. I only have honest ones. I prefer honest ones," she said. He held his hat in both hands and looked at her steadily. "I have not allowed myself to think about a future with another person since Ruth died," he said. "I convinced myself it would be disloyal to her, or too much risk, or any number of other reasons that sounded reasonable and were mostly fear with better clothes on." He paused. "You arrived here in January, and since then every reasonable argument I have made to myself has failed, one after the other, and I find that I would like to court you properly, with your permission, if you are willing." Mary Shepard stood in the April desert sun and felt every careful wall she had ever built between herself and hope go down all at once. "I am willing," she said. He nodded once. The almost smile appeared. "Good," he said, as if they had concluded a sensible negotiation, and then his sons came pelting back around the corner of the church arguing about marble ownership, and the moment opened up into ordinary afternoon life. The courtship that followed was conducted with the full, careful respect that Elijah had promised, and it was also the most emotionally clarifying 8 weeks of Mary's life. He drove the wagon in from the ranch on Sunday afternoons, and they walked in the desert while his sons ranged ahead of them arguing about lizards and rock formations, and the stories Daniel made up to explain natural features that Samuel then corrected with facts. Elijah always had something useful in the wagon, food or water, or a blanket against the evening chill, because providing for things was how he expressed care, the physical equivalent of the words he said slowly and carefully when he said them at all. She learned him, the way you learn a landscape, by walking through it repeatedly and paying attention to what changed depending on the weather. She learned that he read widely and thought carefully and held opinions with conviction but not rigidity. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that arrived unexpectedly and was funnier for its rarity. She learned that he was a man who felt things very deeply and had learned, somewhere between Tennessee and New Mexico territory, to keep that depth mostly out of sight, not from dishonesty, but from a kind of self-sufficiency that had become necessary and then habitual, and was now very slowly becoming something he was willing to reconsider. She told him about her mother, and he listened. He told her about Ruth, carefully, honestly, in a way that honored what had been true without making the past an obstacle to what might be possible. Ruth had been kind and strong and deeply loved, and she was gone, and grief was not something you finished, but something you learned to carry differently over time. He told her about April. Ruth's birthday had been April 3rd. He had spent 4 Aprils reminding himself to be present for his sons instead of disappearing into the anniversary of what she would have been. "She would have been 30 this April," he said one Sunday, quietly, not to make her sad but because it was true and he had gotten to the point of being able to say true things in her presence. "Tell me about her," Mary said, and he did. And Mary listened with the whole of her attention, because understanding the woman Elijah had loved was not a threat but a gift, the key to understanding who he was and who his sons were, and what this family had built and lost and was slowly, carefully rebuilding. It was during this period that she began to understand the full scope of what she was being offered and what it would require of her. This was not simply a romance between 2 adults. It was a decision that would affect 2 boys who had already lost one mother, and who were navigating that loss with a complexity and resilience that both moved and humbled her. If she stepped into this, she was stepping into their lives, and the weight of that was not a small thing. She spoke to Clara about it one evening in the boarding house parlor, the fire banked low against the April chill. "Are you afraid?" Clara asked. "Terrified," Mary said honestly. "Not of him, of being wrong, of failing them, of—" She stopped. "Of loving people and losing them," Clara said gently. Mary looked at the fire. "My mother died in November," she said. "And before she died, my father had already been gone in every way that mattered. I know what it costs. I know what the bill looks like at the end." "You also know what it is worth," Clara said. "Which is why you are terrified and not simply cautious." The conversation with Samuel was the one she had not anticipated, and it arrived the way the most significant things did, sideways and without warning. It was a Thursday afternoon in late April. The other students had gone home. Samuel was staying late to finish a geography project, and Mary was grading at her desk when he looked up from his work and said, without preamble, "Are you going to marry my father?" She put down her pen. He was looking at her with those gray-green eyes, utterly serious, the question delivered with the directness of a boy who had learned from a man who said what he meant. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That is not a decision that has been made." He looked at his paper for a moment. "Daniel likes you," he said. "He told me last week that he wished you could come and live at the ranch and teach us at home, because then he would not have to ride to school in the cold." "That sounds very like Daniel," she said. Samuel was quiet for another moment. "My mother," he stopped, started again. "I was 8 when she died. I remember her very well. I remember how she laughed, and the way the kitchen smelled when she made bread." And he stopped again, and Mary waited. "Father has not been he has been doing all right, he keeps everything going, but there has been a part of him that has been very quiet for 4 years. "I know," she said softly. "It is not as quiet now," Samuel said, with the careful precision of someone delivering a report. "Since you came, it is less quiet." Mary Shepard had managed not to cry in front of students all year. She did not entirely succeed at this moment, but she managed to keep it to a very private and contained quality that might, if Samuel were generous in his interpretation, have been dismissed as something in her eye. "Samuel," she said carefully, "how do you feel about it? Not Daniel, you." He was quiet for a long time. "I think my mother would have liked you," he said finally. "She liked people who said true things. She did not have much patience for people who went sideways around the truth." He picked up his pencil. "I think it would be all right," he said, in the manner of someone rendering a considered verdict, "if you stayed." She finished grading with her heart in an entirely different place than it had been when the school day began. The conversation with Elijah happened 2 days later, a Saturday, when he had come to town for supplies and stopped at the boarding house to see if she wanted to walk to the edge of town, where there was a ridge that gave a remarkable view of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the distance. They stood on the ridge, and she told him what Samuel had said, relaying it carefully and completely because he deserved to know his son's heart. When she finished, Elijah was silent for a moment, looking at the mountains. Then he said, "He is 12 years old, and he is already a better man than I was at 12. He paused. "Or at 32, for that matter." "You are a good man," she said. "Both things can be true." He looked at her then, and the restraint he habitually maintained was gone entirely, and what was underneath it was something so unguarded and so full that she felt it like a physical change in the air between them. "Mary," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, "I would like to ask you to marry me. Not today, not this moment. I want to ask properly when the time is right. But I want you to know that is where I am, and that I am sure of it, and that I want you to think about whether it is where you are too." She thought about her Cincinnati kitchen and her mother's pearl earrings and the advertisement in the back of a newspaper, and a 4-day freight wagon journey, and 12 months of teaching, and a man with gray-green eyes who sent venison to boarding houses and repaired windows without being asked, and who was asking her with the complete seriousness of his whole self whether she could see a future in the same direction he was looking. "I am already thinking about it," she said. "I have been thinking about it for months." He almost smiled, And I am in favor of it, she said. The almost smile became the full thing, rare and real, and worth every one of the 3 months she had spent waiting to see it directed at her without restraint. They did not make formal plans that day. The proposal he had promised was coming, she knew, and Elijah Keating would do it properly and in his own time, and she had learned by now to trust his timing. What she had not planned for was the trap that arrived the following week. Gerald Elmore had not gotten where he was by accepting outcomes that inconvenienced him. He was a man of 70 acres of ego and 12,000 acres of cattle land, and he had decided several years ago that the Keating Ranch would become part of his operation, and he had deployed Patricia toward that goal with the confidence of a man who had not previously been refused anything he wanted. Mary learned what had happened from Clara, who had learned it from Howard Briggs, who had heard it from Frank Dade the Marshal, which was the usual route by which important information traveled in Redemption. Gerald Elmore had sent a man to the county seat at Santa Fe claiming that there was an irregularity in Elijah's land claim, a paperwork error in the original filing from 1870 that he said invalidated the claim. It was, Frank Dade told Clara, almost certainly manufactured. The land office in Santa Fe had found the claim valid in a review 2 years ago. But a formal challenge required Elijah to travel to Santa Fe and defend it in person, which meant leaving his ranch and his sons for potentially 2 weeks, which meant the spring planting would fall behind, which meant potential real financial damage to a ranch already operating on thin margins. Elijah found out on a Wednesday. He came to town Thursday morning, stopping at the school briefly with a face that contained the particular cold stillness of a man managing anger he considers beneath the dignity of display. "I will need to go to Santa Fe," he said quietly to Mary, "for approximately 2 weeks. I have a neighbor, Carl Briggs, Howard's cousin, who can keep an eye on the ranch. The boys will stay in town with Clara Hutchins if she is willing." "Of course she will be," Mary said immediately. And then, with full awareness of what she was offering, "I will look after them, in the evenings after school, whatever they need." Something moved across his face. "You do not have to, I want to," she said. "Go to Santa Fe, handle this, come back." He looked at her with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. "When I come back," he said, "I am going to ask you formally, what I told you on the ridge. I want it to be a proper asking." "I will be here," she said. He left the following Monday, and she spent the next 2 weeks looking after Samuel and Daniel Keating, who were staying in Clara's 2 spare rooms and who required, respectively, steady conversation about important matters and an inexhaustible supply of stories. The 2 weeks were not easy, and they were also among the happiest she had known since arriving in Redemption. She made them breakfast before school on the mornings when Clara's workload was heavy. She sat with them at the kitchen table after school, Samuel doing homework with the focused intensity that was his nature. Daniel sprawled across his chair in a manner that suggested he had no bones, asking her questions about everything from how stars were named to why rivers bent. She read to them every evening. They finished Tom Sawyer, and she started on Great Expectations, which Daniel initially protested was too long and then fell entirely under the spell of within 3 chapters. She learned them more fully in those 2 weeks than she had in 4 months of being their teacher. She learned that Samuel had a deep fear of being useless to the people he loved, the particular anxiety of a boy who had taken on too much responsibility too young and now could not quite let it down. She learned that Daniel processed the world primarily through narrative, that he turned everything into a story as a way of making it manageable, and that the stories he told most often were ones in which his father was the hero. She learned that both boys had their father's stubbornness and their mother's warmth, and that they were, underneath the layers of coping mechanisms that 4 years of loss had deposited, just 2 children who wanted someone to look after them so they could stop being so very old so very young. She wrote in her journal one evening after they were in bed, I understand now what Elijah's proposal really contains. It is not just him. It is all of this. And I find, to my great surprise, that all of this is exactly what I want. The letters from Elijah arrived every few days, addressed to her at Clara's boarding house with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had decided on his course. The letters were not flowery. They were not the elaborate Victorian declarations she had read in novels and always found slightly exhausting. They were Elijah, precise and considered and honest, and beneath the precision, something that was warm and unguarded in a way his letters allowed that his face sometimes couldn't quite manage yet. He wrote about the land office proceedings, which were going well. Gerald Elmore's challenge had turned out to be as baseless as Frank Dade had suspected, and the Santa Fe office was reviewing it with what Elijah described as a visible and satisfying impatience with Elmore's agent. He wrote about Santa Fe itself, the city, in a way that suggested he was observing it for her benefit, thinking about what would interest a woman who had spent her life in cities. He wrote about missing the ranch and missing the particular quality of the silence on his own land. And once, in the fourth letter, he wrote, "I miss Sunday afternoons. I find I have become accustomed to them in a way I had not noticed while they were happening." She read that particular sentence 4 times and then wrote it in her journal. He came back on a Friday afternoon in early May, arriving in town on horseback with the case resolved, and his ranch title secure and Gerald Elmore's manufactured claim dismissed by the land office with a formal notation that it had been filed without merit. She was in the school when Clara sent Daniel running to tell her he had arrived, and she finished the lesson she was in the middle of because she was a professional and her students needed to complete their work. But she dismissed class 10 minutes early, which she had not done once in 4 months, and walked to Clara's boarding house, where Elijah was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, and both his sons crowded against him, with the particular physical insistence of boys who have been missing their father. He looked up when she came through the gate, and the expression on his face was everything she needed to see. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Welcome back," she said. "Thank you," he said. Daniel was already telling him something about Tom Sawyer at considerable volume, and Samuel was watching his father with the quiet relief of someone who had been keeping everything carefully together until the person they trusted most came home. Elijah let Daniel finish his breathless summary of several chapters, and then said to his sons with the quiet authority that was entirely his own, "Go help Mrs. Hutchins with whatever she needs in the kitchen. I need to speak with Miss Shepard." The boys went inside without protest, which told her something about how clearly they understood the situation. She sat down on the top porch step and he sat beside her, and they looked at the quiet May Street of Redemption in the late afternoon light. "Elmore's claim was dismissed entirely," he said. "The land office sent him a formal rebuke. Clara told me." "Good." A beat of silence. "I thought about something while I was in Santa Fe," he said. "Every evening I thought about it." "Did you come to any conclusions?" she asked. He reached into his coat and produced a small ring, a simple gold band with a single modest garnet, and he held it in his palm for a moment before he turned to look at her. "Mary Shepard," he said, "I would like you to be my wife and a mother to my sons, and whatever else this territory requires of us, which is usually more than expected." He paused. "I am not easy, and I am not always warm, and I have a dark country inside me that I am still learning to navigate, and I cannot promise you that everything will be simple. I can promise you that I will love you honestly and well for the rest of my life, and that Samuel and Daniel already," his voice changed texture slightly, "they already love you." Mary Shepard looked at the garnet ring in the palm of his hand and felt something complete itself inside her, the way a sentence finds its period. "Yes," she said. "To all of it." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it in the afternoon light, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen since coming to New Mexico territory. There was a sound from behind the boarding house door, a very poorly suppressed sound of celebration, and Elijah looked toward it with a weariness that was entirely loving. "They knew you were going to ask," she said. "I may have told them this morning," he said, "that I was going to ask you today." "And what did they say?" He looked at the ring on her finger, with a quiet satisfaction that she was beginning to understand, was his version of an open and joyful expression. "Daniel said it was the best idea you had ever had," he said, "and Samuel said it was about time." She laughed, a full and genuine laugh, and he looked at her when she laughed in a way that made her feel seen all the way down. They were married in June of 1878 in the Redemption Church, with Pastor Elias Webb officiating and Clara Hutchins weeping with a grace and dignity that managed to be completely unashamed. Samuel stood at his father's side with the composed seriousness of a boy receiving a sacred responsibility, and Daniel was supposed to stand beside him, but spent most of the ceremony turned around watching the congregation, which was entirely Daniel. She wore her good dress, the blue-gray wool that was too warm for June but was the finest thing she owned, and she carried a handful of wildflowers that Daniel had gotten up at dawn to pick from the desert hillside east of town, arriving at the boarding house with them in his fist and dirt on his knees and a gap-toothed grin that made her want to cry. She was Mary Keating when the afternoon light began to slant gold through the church windows, and she walked out into the Redemption Street on her husband's arm, feeling that the word future had changed its character entirely, had lost its quality of threat, and become something she walked toward with open hands. The first year of their marriage was exactly as complex and rewarding, and occasionally difficult as Elijah had promised, and it was also deeply, genuinely happy in a way that surprised her by being not the dramatic happiness of stories, but the quieter and more durable kind, the kind that was built of ordinary days that added up to something remarkable. She continued teaching through the fall, until the December when she came to understand she was expecting their first child, which she told him on a cold morning in their ranch kitchen while he was drinking coffee, and she was watching the steam rise from the cup with the particular focus of someone organizing words. He put down the cup and looked at her for a long moment, and then he crossed the room and held her, just held her, with his face against her hair, and she felt the warmth of him all the way down. The baby came in August of 1879, a boy, and they named him Thomas, and Thomas arrived in the world with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's determined chin, and the immediate thunderous outrage of someone who had not been consulted about being born and had opinions about it. Daniel declared Thomas the greatest development in the history of the ranch, and Samuel held him with the careful reverence of someone handling something irreplaceable. Elijah held him the way he held everything that mattered most, quietly, with his full attention, as if the rest of the world could wait. Mary recovered from the birth in the ranch house bedroom, the first bedroom that was genuinely her own since Cincinnati, and looked at her family, the man beside her and the baby in the cradle and the two older boys who checked on her with an endearing and overlapping frequency, and felt something that had no word grand enough for it. The two boys had given it to her after all. Not their father, not the ring, not the June wedding, but the ordinary days that came before and after. The way they called her Miss Mary, for months after the wedding in a middle ground between formal and intimate. And then Samuel said, "Ma," one morning without seeming to notice he'd said it, and then Daniel said it too, and then it was just what it was. Which brought her, finally, back to that Sunday morning in April of 1880, when she was 26 years old, and had been married for nearly 2 years, and had a 7-month-old son sleeping in the next room and a new plan of her own that she had not yet found the right moment to tell Elijah. She had woken early before the household stirred, and lay in the quiet listening to the desert morning come alive, and she had been thinking about her mother and the hymn, "Be Thou My Vision," the one Mary Shepard had sung over washboards and bread-making and long Ohio winter mornings. It had been in her mind all week for no reason she could name except that sometimes grief and love were indistinguishable, and this felt like both, a missing and a gratitude at the same time. She had gotten up and washed her face and was sitting at the small writing desk in the bedroom composing a letter to her father, which she did irregularly and with great difficulty. Harold Shepard was out of federal custody now, living in a boarding house in Columbus with much reduced circumstances and a genuine and apparently sincere correspondence that was slowly, very slowly, becoming something she was learning to receive without putting all her armor on first. The letter was about Thomas. Harold Shepard had a grandson he had not seen, and whatever she felt about her father, Thomas had not committed any of his grandfather's sins. She was deep in the letter when the singing started. Two voices, outside the window, "Be thou my vision." She had pressed her hand to her chest and held very still and then gone to the window. Samuel, hat to his heart. Daniel, chin up, singing like he meant to be heard in the next county. And Elijah, 15 feet behind them, hat in his hands, watching her window. She had gripped the sill and told herself not to cry. She had not succeeded. She threw on her coat over her nightgown and went downstairs and out the front door of the ranch house, and the boys stopped singing when they heard the door and turned to look at her. Daniel with the expression of someone awaiting a verdict. Samuel with the quiet watchfulness of someone who had already calculated several outcomes. "How?" she said, and she had to stop because the word came out too full of everything to be followed immediately by the rest of the sentence. She tried again. "How did you know that hymn?" Daniel grinned. It was the gap-toothed grin, the one that had been disarming her since January of 1878. "Father told us," he said. "He said it was your favorite and that you used to sing it quietly sometimes when you thought no one was listening, and he had been listening, and he thought we should learn it." She looked past the boys to Elijah, who was standing with his hat in his hands and that expression that was the one she now had a name for, the one that was home, the one that was everything he did not often find words for but found ways to say. "You notice me singing that," she said to him. "I notice everything about you," he said, and it was the plainest and most complete declaration she had ever heard. She crossed the yard toward him, coat loose around her, hair undone, barefoot in the desert morning, and his sons parted for her the way boys do for things that are larger than them, with a cheerful and knowing willingness that was half warmth and half barely contained victory. She stopped in front of Elijah and looked up at him. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her face and read it with the precision of a man who had been paying close attention for 2 years. His expression shifted. "Are you—" "Yes," she said. He closed his eyes for just a moment, and when he opened them the gray-green was so warm and full that she had to press her own hands against her cheeks to hold the feeling in. He pulled her into his arms, and she put her face against his chest, and behind her she could hear Daniel asking Samuel something in a loud whisper and Samuel telling him to be quiet in a tone that was fighting a smile. "Thomas is going to have a brother or a sister," she told the boys over Elijah's shoulder. Daniel's response was immediate and entirely Daniel. "I hope it is a brother. I hope we name him Huckleberry." "We are not naming him Huckleberry," Samuel said with great patience. "We do not know yet that it is a him," Mary said. "I am going to teach him to ride," Daniel said, evidently having decided these details were negotiable and his preferred outcome was not. "I am going to teach him everything." Elijah kept his arms around her, and she felt the laughter move through his chest before it came out, quiet and real, the laugh that still happened rarely enough to be remarkable every time. They went inside for breakfast, all 4 of them, and Thomas woke from his morning sleep in the crib by the kitchen fireplace, and Daniel immediately appropriated him in the practiced manner of an older brother who had staked his claim, bouncing him on a knee with more enthusiasm than Thomas strictly required, but to Thomas's apparent satisfaction. Samuel set the table, because Samuel set the table every morning, had done since before Mary came, would probably still be doing it when he had a ranch of his own somewhere. Elijah stood at the stove making coffee and looked across the kitchen at her where she sat at the table, and the look was the quiet, complete, satisfied look of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. She thought about the advertisement in the Cincinnati newspaper, 12 lines of small print, and a different future entirely. She thought about Amos Dill and his freight wagon and the first sight of Redemption's red dirt Main Street. She thought about Clara Hutchins pouring coffee and delivering intelligence briefings, and weeping with perfect dignity at a June wedding. She thought about a 12-year-old boy saying it was about time, and a 9-year-old arriving at school with dirt on his cuffs and enormous eyes for stories. She thought about Be Thou My Vision rising through pine walls on an April morning, sung in young voices that cracked on the high notes and recovered with fierce determination. Be Thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. The oldest prayer, stripped down to the essential thing. Let me see what matters. Let me not mistake the world's noise for the world's meaning. Let me know what to hold on to, she knew. After breakfast, while the boys were occupied and Thomas was happily investigating a wooden spoon Daniel had given him for the purpose, she told Elijah about the letter to her father, the one she had been writing when she heard the singing. He listened without interrupting, which was always his way. When she finished, he said, "What do you want from it?" "The correspondence." She thought about it. "I want Thomas to have a grandfather," she said. I want to be a person who can allow for change in others, because if I cannot allow for it in my father, what am I saying about whether it is possible at all?" He was quiet for a moment. "That is very generous of you," he said. "It is very difficult of me," she corrected. "Those are different things." "Both," he said, "both at once." She finished the letter that afternoon and posted it on Monday. Her father wrote back within 3 weeks, a letter that was careful and small and trying very hard, the way things that are trying hard have a particular quality that you can recognize even when you are not entirely ready to trust it. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning of one, which was what most things were. The summer of 1880 built the new baby and built the ranch, and built the family into something that had roots now, not just intentions. Samuel turned 13 in July, and Elijah gave him his first horse of his own, a young roan gelding that Samuel named Cicero, which struck Daniel as extremely funny and Elijah as unsurprising. "Where did you get Cicero?" Daniel demanded. "He is a Roman orator," Samuel said serenely. "He was known for precision of thought." "He is a horse," Daniel said. "He is my horse," Samuel said with finality. Daniel named his own horse, an older pinto that had been on the ranch for years, Captain, and considered the matter settled. Mary's second pregnancy went smoothly, and in late November of 1880, in the ranch house bedroom with Dr. Harmon Priestley attending and Clara Hutchins present because Mary had specifically asked her to be, another Keating arrived in the world, a daughter. They named her Eleanor for Mary's mother, and Eleanor came into the world with Elijah's dark hair and a temper that announced itself immediately and appeared to be settling in for a long stay. Elijah held Eleanor the same way he had held Thomas, with the particular full-attention quiet that was his version of reverence. He looked at the baby and then at Mary, and he did not say anything because he did not need to. And she understood him perfectly, which was the thing that was better even than love, knowing what someone meant without needing the translation. Daniel said Eleanor was exactly what he would have ordered and immediately took up a position as her unofficial champion that he would maintain, with characteristic determination and considerable noise, for the rest of his childhood. Samuel said, with the gravity of someone reporting an important fact, "She has father's eyes already." And this was true, the gray-green already showing itself in Eleanor's first squinting appraisal of the world. Christmas of 1880 came with the cold and the pine smell, and a tree that Daniel had demanded, and Samuel had helped locate and Elijah had cut and carried home on the wagon, and Mary had decorated with the small collection of ornaments she had carried from Cincinnati, the few things she had managed to keep from the life before, and the ranch house was small but warm and full of the particular noise that 4 children of various sizes make when they are all in the same space on Christmas morning. She stood in the kitchen doorway watching it, and Elijah came and stood beside her with his coffee, and she leaned into him, and he put his arm around her and they watched their family together, The two older boys and the baby and the toddler and the fire and the tree and the light. "Be thou my vision," she murmured quietly, not to him, just to the room, just to the morning. He bent his head and kissed her temple and said just as quietly, "You are mine." The years that followed built on each other the way years do when you are building something real, each one adding to what came before rather than replacing it. The territory kept changing around them, the railroad coming closer each year, more settlers arriving, the land shifting under 100 competing claims and needs. Elijah navigated it with the careful attention he brought to everything, expanding the ranch modestly and wisely, building water infrastructure that 3 years later would save them through a drought that hit neighboring operations very hard. Patricia Elmore married a banker from Albuquerque in 1881 and moved east. Gerald Elmore died of a heart condition in 1882, and his land was sold at auction in pieces that went to 5 different ranchers, none of whom were particularly more or less aggressive about it than the man had been, which was simply how land operated in the territory. Frank Dade retired as marshal in 1882 and was replaced by a younger man named Torres who was by all accounts considerably more effective. Clara Hutchins kept her boarding house and kept her table extraordinarily well, and was present at every major event in the Keating family's life from that point forward, with a consistency that made her something between family and institution. Mary continued teaching until Eleanor was 3 years old and then stepped back from the schoolroom, the territory having finally funded a second teacher for the expanded school, and devoted her considerable energies to the ranch, to her family, and to a small library she established in the church building using a grant she successfully applied for from a Cincinnati philanthropic organization, which had the particular satisfaction of Cincinnati contributing to redemption in a way she would not have predicted in January of 1878. Samuel Keating grew into precisely the man you would have predicted from the boy, steady and careful and quietly remarkable, with a depth of integrity that people recognized instinctively. He read law on his own time in the evenings, with access to books Mary requested and obtained for him, and at 19 went to Santa Fe to read under an attorney there, coming back 2 years later with a license to practice and a quiet determination that served him well for decades. Daniel Keating grew into exactly what you would have predicted from him too, which was to say that he grew up with the same enormous energy and narrative imagination and deep loyalty, but added to it a capability with horses that was becoming, by his late teens, something approaching mastery. He worked the ranch alongside his father with a competence and willingness that never seemed to reduce his capacity for finding things to be enthusiastic about, which was, Elijah observed once with private satisfaction, a great deal better than the alternative. Thomas grew up between his 2 older brothers and learned from both of them, inheriting Samuel's attention and Daniel's expressiveness in a combination that was entirely his own. Eleanor grew up with opinions about everything, which she delivered with her father's directness and her mother's precision, and a confidence that Elijah privately found both alarming and extremely gratifying. The spring of 1882 brought Mary's 4th pregnancy, which produced another son, a solid and cheerful boy they named James after Elijah's own father, and who came into the world looking exactly like Elijah had apparently looked as a baby, according to the single daguerreotype Elijah possessed of himself at that age, which he produced from the bottom of a trunk and showed her with a dry amusement at his own younger self. "You were very serious looking," she said. "I was born that way," he said. James was not, she noted. James had come into the world laughing, which Priestley called unprecedented in his experience. "He gets that from you," Elijah said. "I am not always laughing," she protested. "You are more than you know," he said. In 1884, with the ranch established and the children growing and the territory continuing its long, complicated process of becoming Arizona and New Mexico states in a future they were beginning to be able to imagine, Elijah and Mary sat on their porch one September evening in the cooling air and watched the stars come out over the desert. She was 30 years old. He was 38. They had been married 6 years, which contained multitudes. The children were inside, the older boys playing chess with a seriousness Daniel had never actually felt but performed convincingly enough to beat Samuel occasionally, a leaner asleep. James recently put to bed by Elijah with the efficiency of a man who had been putting children to bed for decades. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked, not as an accusation or a worry, just as a genuine question, the kind he asked sometimes in the evening quiet. She thought about it seriously because he deserved a serious answer. "I regret my mother did not live to know you," she said. "She would have loved you. That is generous." "She loved honest things," Mary said. "She would have found you restful." He made the quiet sound that was his version of a laugh. "Restful." "She was tired of performance," Mary said. "She would have found your directness a relief." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I think about the fact that Ruth never knew you," he said. "There are moments when that feels like a wrong in the world. That two people he paused in the way he paused when he was choosing words carefully. Two people who matter to me never occupied the same world." She reached over and found his hand in the dark. He turned his palm up and held hers. "The desert night was very quiet and very full. She would have known our sons," Mary said softly. "That is something." "She is in them, Elijah. She is in Samuel's watchfulness and Daniel's laugh and the way they both love things completely without apology. She is not gone, she is just changed." He was quiet for a long time. His hand was warm around hers. "You are—" He stopped, tried again. "The word I want doesn't exist," he said finally. "Tell me the shape of it," she said. He thought. "You take hard things and hold them in the light until they are bearable," he said. "You have done that from the first day you came here. The children, the land, me." He paused. "There should be a word for that." "There are several words," she said, "but I think the one you are looking for is home." He turned to look at her. The starlight made everything soft and dark and possible. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly the one." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the September night while the desert breathed around them and the stars multiplied overhead. And inside the house, their children existed in all their noise and complexity and beauty. And the next morning was a Sunday, and before breakfast, in the early light that made the desert floor look like hammered copper, she could hear Elijah speaking to the boys in the yard, something low and instructional, and she leaned against the kitchen doorframe and listened. And she heard Samuel say, "All right," from the beginning. And then the two of them, her sons, the ones who had been singing outside a boarding house window 2 years ago and who were growing into people who astonished her daily, began again with the first line of the oldest and most beloved thing, "Be thou my vision," her mother's hymn, the prayer she had carried across half a continent in the lining of her heart. She closed her eyes and listened, and the music went straight into her without any intermediary at all. James appeared at her side with sleep in his eyes and leaned against her leg. She put her hand on his head. Eleanor called from the bedroom with the commanding volume of someone who had decided it was morning. Thomas could be heard negotiating with his shoes. Elijah came to the kitchen door, looked at her standing there with James against her leg and the hymn still moving through the yard air. And he stopped and looked at her the way he had looked at her that first April Sunday when she had been at the window, and he had been 15 feet behind his sons with his hat in his hands and everything unspoken between them. Except it was all spoken now. All of it, all the complicated and beautiful and difficult and rich contents of 6 years, all spoken and known and settled and real. "Breakfast," he said. "I heard," she said. "The boys wanted to run through it once more before church." "I know," she said. "I am glad." He held the door for her and she came inside, and the morning assembled itself around them, as ordinary and as miraculous as every other morning of their life together, and she moved through it knowing it completely, which was the thing she had come all the way across a continent to find. Not certainty about the world. The world was not certain. There was drought and hardship and grief, and the long injustice of land and power, and the complicated inheritance of the past that honest people carried with them and did not pretend away. But this kitchen, this man who had noticed her singing when she thought no one was listening and had taught her hymn to his sons so they could sing it outside her window. These children who had grown under her hands like the desert grew after rain, improbably and completely, and with their own fierce insistence on being exactly what they were. She had come to redemption. She had found it. And every Sunday morning from that point forward, in the April light or the August heat or the December cold, she could hear it if she listened. The shape of the life she had chosen, singing itself back to her in voices she would know anywhere, in a hymn that had carried her across the dark country and into the only kind of morning that mattered. The morning where everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.